This week we're looking at Acts 2 and the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. So I'm going to start by reading the first few verses of Acts 2 now. When the day of Pentecost arrived, they were all together in one place, and suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. And divided tongues as of fire appeared to them and rested on each one of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. It's important to remember when reading this passage that this wasn't a random, spontaneous event, but the outpouring of God's Spirit was a long-awaited moment by the people of God. If you read the Old Testament, you can read about the prophets speaking of a time that God would pour out his Spirit, not just on specific people, but on all flesh, on young and old, on male and female. And it's interesting that Pentecost, the Jewish festival, which was the day when the Spirit was poured out, was also known as the Feast of the First Fruits, which celebrated the first produce the Israelites had in the Promised Land. And just as when the Israelites left Egypt, it was the dawn of something new, they went on a journey through the wilderness to enter the Promised Land. When God poured out his Spirit, it was the dawn of something new and the first fruits of what was to come. Now a pillar of fire led Israel out of Egypt and guided them through the wilderness. And now Holy Spirit fire rested on each of the disciples, empowering them to live this new life in the power of the Holy Spirit and fulfill the commission that Jesus had given them to go and make disciples. So God was continuing his plan of salvation through the work of his disciples. And the symmetry we see between the story of the Israelites and then the story of Jesus' disciples as they were filled with the Holy Spirit just shows God's faithfulness and reminds the disciples that God is faithful and that he fulfills his promises. The last thing that Jesus said to his disciples before he ascended into heaven was that I will always be with you, I will never leave you. And he promised he would send one like him to help them through everything they were about to go through. His presence was promised as an assurance, as a seal. And God fulfilled his promise by sending the Holy Spirit. And we read about that earlier. Now there are two words for filled that are used in this passage in the original language, and one talks about an inward filling, because when we are filled with the Holy Spirit we are transformed from the inside out to become more like Jesus as we follow him. And the other filling is an outward filling, a filling of the Holy Spirit for empowerment, for service, for all God has called us for. And we can see with the disciples that when they were filled with the Holy Spirit they were empowered to go and preach the gospel to all those who were gathered that day. And just like the disciples received the Holy Spirit for those two purposes, for inward transformation and for outward service to God, we too have access to this amazing Holy Spirit which empowers us in our day-to-day lives and helps us to do everything God has called us to do. I love how in the passage it says rested on each one of them. You know, it didn't just rest in the room and people sort of grabbed it. It rested on each one of them. It was specific to each member who was gathered there. It shows that God values each one of us and wants us each to be filled and empowered by the Holy Spirit as we live our lives. And I think this passage is really relevant today as well, because as we are in a situation which is unknown and uncertain with the coronavirus, we need to remember that just like those disciples were in that room waiting for the promised Holy Spirit, they were uncertain, they were unsure, they were probably afraid of what was to come. But they knew that God had promised to be with them and to send the Holy Spirit. And just like they held on to God's promises, then we can hold on to God's promises now that he will always be with us and that he has a plan and he knows what he's doing. And we can see through the whole story of the Bible how God has always been faithful and always had a plan, so we can trust him today.